In 2025, I knit a grand total of 42 projects. And I say knit, but actually 39 of them were knit and 3 of them were crochet. So there was a bit of crochet that snuck in there at the end. So I think it's pretty important not to go comparing numbers against other people, but I'm happy with this as a final number for the year, mostly compared to how I've been going over the last few years. So my knitting mojo's been a little bit up and down, and I don't think you can make your way through this many projects without actually enjoying yourself. So I'm just mostly taking this as a good sign that I'm actually enjoying my knitting again for the first time in a while, and I'm pretty glad with how I've gone and that I'm actually having fun with it. So to explain why I've got a bunch of pretty graphics going on, I have to show you my first statistic of the day, which is who I actually knit for this year. So over the course of the year, I knit 5 items for work, which were samples that I had to give to a yarn company or another knitwear designer. I knit 7 things for charity and 20 items as gifts. So if we break this down into how many things I knit for myself versus other people, I actually knit 10 things for myself and a whole 32 items that were not mine. And that means that I don't have a lot of my knitting for the year here with me. So I figured if we sat down and did a more traditional everything that I knit video, it might get a bit tiresome after a while because I don't have items to show you. I would mostly have photos and B-roll. And so I figured maybe we'd try switching it up and doing a bit more of a PowerPoint statistics presentation, which I am pretty excited about because I am a bit of a nerd at the end of the day. I was a software engineer in a previous life, and if this is not up your alley, then that's totally cool. But for those of you who like numbers and things, come with me and I will take you on a journey through my year. So if we haven't met before, I'm Katrina Walser from Oliphant and I'm a knitter based in Sydney, Australia. And so to kick us off, I figured I'd just go through the number of items I made in each category, and I just broke these down into categories that I find interesting, that made sense to me. So first off, I knit 4 items of homeware, 4 hair accessories, 9 beanies, 3 scarves, 3 pairs of socks, 3 other accessories, 6 toys, 6 kids garments, and 4 adult garments. So broken down into a bit of a graph, this is what it looks like. And I think this is interesting because I think most of the podcasters and just other knitters I know skew very heavily towards the adult garment category, but I really knit a whole bunch of different things. And I like it. I like the variety, and I like that I can knit for other people than myself. But this is actually just categories and numbers. And if you look at it, most of these things are quite small. So I thought it'd be more interesting to break it down into how much yardage or meterage went to each of those categories, because I think that it makes more sense as a measure of how much time I've put into each category. And so if you rearrange the numbers and look at it that way, it ends up looking more like this. So it makes sense because toys and socks and scarves are quite small. The tiny, tiny little sliver is actually the other accessories category. But the garments and the homeware are quite big. And the reason that the homeware slice is so large is because I knit a whole blanket, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So yeah, I think breaking it down by the number of meters in each category is a bit more of an honest explanation of where I spent my time. And so I did spend a lot more time knitting garments than it initially looked like, but it's still less than half of the amount of knitting that I did over the year. So if we do the same meterage trick with the me versus not me graph that I showed you earlier, then it looks more like this. And so I did actually spend a bit more time knitting for myself than it initially looked like, but it's still well under half of the amount of knitting time that I spent over the course of the year. So one of the things I find interesting at the end of the year is looking at the new techniques that I learnt over the course of the year. So I've got 4 this year that I did. The first one is double knit button bands. And this is something that I've been wanting to do for a really long time. I've watched a lot of knitting podcasts in the last 2 or 3 years where people have started really leaning into double knit button bands, and I've been wanting to try it myself. So I tested the technique out on a couple of baby cardigans first, and then I did it on a full adult cardigan for myself. And that was something that I actually altered the pattern to have. The cardigan that I did it on had a regular ribbed button band, so I just changed it to have a double knit button band instead. And I really like how it turned out. It looks really polished, and I'm glad to have done it and learned how to do it. The next thing I really leaned into last year was grafting. So I actually knew how to do this previously, but I always had to look up a tutorial and try and figure out from scratch again how to do it because I didn't do it enough to remember. And now I've done it enough that it's really solidified in my head and I just know how to do it off the top of my head now, which I think is a good technique to have. Now, if you don't know what grafting is, it's when you sew live stitches together at the end of a project. Most people call it Kitchener stitch, but there are some issues with who Kitchener was. So we're just going to call it grafting from now on. So one of the things that grafting actually gave me was the confidence to sew through the ends of my knitting because I used to hate sewing to finish a project off. And so because of this, one of the new things that I really did try this year was a tubular bind off. So I know a lot of people do tubular bind offs. It's a pretty common technique now because it gives a very polished edge to your knitting. But I just never wanted to do it because I didn't like sewing the ends in. But I've realized that tubular bind offs are very, very, very similar to grafting at the end of the day. And so I gave it a shot finally on a jumper that I was working on and I really like it. So I'm going to be doing it more from now on. So the last new technique to me this year were European shoulders, which it's a bit of a funny name. I'm not too sure officially if it has a name. That's what I mostly see it referenced as. In the sewing world, I think people call it a fully fashioned shoulder. But anyway, it is a way of seaming a garment where instead of the shoulder seam sitting right up here on the edge of your shoulder, it sits on the back of your shoulder and it runs basically from the back of your neck till about halfway between the top of your shoulder and your underarm. So it's not a full raglan. It's more of a slope that goes along the top of your back and then you hang the front of the garment off of that. And so it's becoming more and more common. I think a lot of petite knit patterns use it as a construction, but I hadn't really run into it until the beginning of last year when I was making a top for my niece. And so I tried it in a couple of adult garments later in the year, and it's a pretty fun technique. I'm curious to see if I can learn a bit more about it because I'd like to know how to actually design a pattern like this as opposed to just knitting it from other people's patterns. So I may be doing a bit more investigation into it over the course of this year. So I've been knitting for almost 30 years. I just turned 38 yesterday, and I'm pretty sure someone taught me how to knit when I was around 8. So I just want to use this as an encouragement to you to learn something new, because if I can learn 4 new things in a year, even after this much knitting time, then you can too. And yeah, there's just always something to learn with knitting and always something new to try. So I'd really encourage you to try new things because it's just a lot of fun. So I figured I'd be a little remiss if I didn't at least talk about some projects instead of just throwing numbers at you. So let's go over my top 5 projects for the year. So going in order of when I knit these, the first one that I have for you is the Jaspy Scarf, which is a project that I adapted pretty heavily from the Jaspy Shawl by Kika Gullion. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, so if anyone can correct me, I'd appreciate it. Now, this is the second one of these I've made, so I didn't have to make up the adaptations as I went this time. I already knew what I was doing with it, but the main adaptation I made is that I made it quite skinny. So the Jaspy shawl is quite wide, and so the version that I make is more of a scarf width, and it only has 2 of the lacy panels in it, as opposed to, I think there are 3 in the main shawl. So the yarn I used was Pearl Soho Sweetgrass, which is a 4-ply cotton and alpaca blend, and this was from my stash. So this was a scarf that I knit for my auntie, and it's with her in the Philippines. So the next project that I have is something I'm calling my choo-choo, and it's a deliberate mispronunciation of a French word because I got so many Instagram ads for this particular company that was selling French scrunchies, and they were giant scrunchies that retailed for about $60, so I figured that if I wanted one, I would just knit it myself instead of shelling out that much money for it. So I made this pattern up. It's basically just a skinny long tube that I cast on somewhere about here, and then I knit all the way up until I was happy with the length, and then I just grafted the ends together. So this was worked in By Corolla Down Under's sock yarn, and also in Three Cats Knit mohair silk. And so held together that made about an 8-ply yarn. And this all came from stash. And I'm mostly having this as a highlight for the year because from when I bound it off to when I got my hair cut, I'm pretty sure I wore this every day. So it turns out that giant scrunchies are actually a good thing to have in your wardrobe. And it's nice to be able to wear something knit even when it's super hot and you don't want to be wearing any actual knit items, because I like trying to wear at least one knitted thing every day. And so this was a good thing to have as an accessory, and I'd like to make more of them when my hair grows out a little bit more. So the next highlight for the year is my Stella quilt blanket, which I do have here, but it's a little bit too big to show you on camera, so the photos will just have to do. But this is huge and it's gorgeous and squishy, and it's what contributed the most to the slice of the pie graph that was for me when you did it by yardage, because it's just took up so much yarn. So this is a pattern by Laura Penrose, and the neutral color is a Bendigo Woollen Mills 4-ply luxury yarn held double, and all of the colors are scraps out of my stash. So I'm mostly calling this a scrappy project. And I actually won an award at the Easter show for it last year. So this is my ribbon for coming second in the blanket category. And for those of you who don't know, the Easter show is an agricultural show that we have in Sydney every year. It's a really big show and they have a craft competition every year. And so I've entered it in the last 3 years. And this is the second time I've gotten a prize. So I'm pretty proud of my blanket. The next highlight that I have is my Porter Junior. So again, this is an existing pattern, but it's one that I had to modify and improvise pretty heavily. So this is for my son. It is about a sort of 18-month, 2-year-old size. And essentially what happened is that I had made a jumper using the pattern, which is called Porter by Megan Babin, for my husband a couple of years ago. And I had enough leftover yarn that I wanted to make a matching one for my son. But the pattern didn't size down to a baby size. And also there is a baby Porter, but it's not written for the same yarn. It's actually written for a 4-ply yarn. And I really wanted to use the yarn that I had. So I just took all of the cable charts in the pattern and I adapted it into a kid size. So the yarn that I used is Knit Picks Wool of the Andes, both the superwash and the non-superwash version, and it's in 10-ply like I mentioned, and so that's all from stash. And I'm really, really proud of how this turned out. I think it's super cute and they look really cute matching together when they wear them at the same time. And this is actually going to be one of my Easter show entries for this year. And the last project that I have as a highlight is actually 2 of my separate projects mixed together. So this is my Santa cardigan that I made for my brother-in-law. I spoke about it a little bit at the end of last year, but essentially it is a pattern that I completely self-drafted. The cardigan was knit out of BWM 8-ply luxury in both cream and a red color. I can't remember the colorway exactly, but it was in my last podcast episode. And this finally wasn't from stash. I actually did purchase this for the project. It was a lot of yarn to buy, but it was well worth it because I love how it turned out. And so the Christmas lights were his request. He wanted a string of lights that would run across the back of the cardigan. So I used a crochet pattern called Christmas Lights by Faye Lith. And so this I did use from stash. The colors were all different types of yarn. Some of them were 5-ply, some of them were 8-ply, and it turned out really nicely. I haven't actually seen him wearing this yet because we went away at the end of last year just before Christmas, and so I gifted it to him and I didn't get to see him wear it. So hopefully I'll get to see it in person on him sometime soon because I'm really excited. This was the biggest dopamine knit. Like once I finished it, I put it straight on and I literally could not stop laughing. It's just hilarious and I had so much fun making it. So I'm really, really glad to have made it, and yeah, I'm just excited to see him wearing it in real life. So if you'll have noticed as I was talking, I said that a lot of the projects that I worked on this year and my highlights were improvised, which is the word that I'm using just to say that I either made up a pattern or a project as I went along, or I just heavily modified an existing pattern. And I do that a lot. And I actually thought that I did it a lot more than I did this year, because I actually went through and looked at all of my projects and broke it down into where the different patterns for the projects came from. And it ended up looking like this. So of my 42 projects, 5 of them were from existing patterns which I wrote, 18 of them were existing patterns which I didn't write, 15 projects were improvised, and 4 of them were new patterns that I was designing over the course of the year. And so if you split that up into basically existing patterns and things that I was making up, a little over half of the projects were made up from existing patterns. So before I looked at these numbers, I would have actually assumed this graph would have swung pretty heavily the other way. And I think it's because when you're working through a pattern and making it up as you go, then it takes up a lot of mental energy. But when you're just using an existing pattern, it's the knitting that takes up more of the energy and the space in your head. And so I think the patterns where I've improvised just loom a little larger in my brain, because there's so much more thinking involved as opposed to just knitting. And so, yeah, it was an interesting thing to look at. But maybe I should give my brain a bit more of a break this year and just work a bit more from patterns that actually exist. So next up, I wanted to look at some numbers to do with yarn. And the first thing I wanted to look at were the different yarn weights and needle sizes that I used. So just to clarify here, when I say yarn weight, I mean the overall yarn weight for a project. So if I held 2 yarns together, I counted them into the category for what the yarn weight would be if you doubled it up. So for example, if I was knitting a 4-ply and a mohair held together, then I counted that project in the 8-ply category. Similarly with needle size, I've only counted the main needle size for a project here. So if I had a main needle size for the body of a jumper, for example, but the ribbing was knit in a smaller needle size, I just counted that project into the main needle size category. So I'm skewing very heavily towards the middle here. I knit most of my projects in 8-ply, and then following along from that, the majority of the projects were knit on either a 4mm or a 3.75mm needle. And so I think that tracks. I have noticed that amongst newer knitters, they tend to knit on chunkier yarn, and then as they get more and more comfortable with knitting, they focus more on thinner and thinner yarn weights. And I found that that was my progression too. So I mentioned that I started knitting when I was 8 or so, but I was a little bit on and off over the years as a teenager. And then I got really, really serious about it when I moved to the States in 2016. And so I still around then was knitting with very, very chunky yarn. And I didn't really start getting finer and finer until I was a couple of years into my sort of knitting revival. And I do also think that the move to Australia has helped that, because I've noticed in America, it's way more common to use 10-ply yarn, but since I've moved back home, it's a lot more common to use 8-ply. And so I think it's a good, happy middle ground between getting projects knit a little faster, because if you knit on 4-ply, it just takes a really long time. And also getting to knit with things that are a bit more adjusted to our climate, because really, really, really chunky knits aren't very suitable for the Sydney weather. So yeah, I think that's why I've sort of landed in the 8-ply category mostly. So the next thing that I wanted to look at was whether or not I was using Australian yarn, because that's something that's really important to me. And so I went through and I didn't tag every single yarn that I've used, because especially for a project like the blanket, there were so many yarns in this. So I just went through and looked at each project and figured out if the majority of it was made from Australian yarn or not. And I'm happy to say that yes, I am really using a lot of Australian yarn. So 34 of my projects were mostly made out of an Aussie yarn, and only 8 of them were made out of a yarn from overseas. And so I'm very happy with that number. And I would encourage you, regardless of where you are, whether you're in Australia or you're not, to try and source yarn that is local to you, just because I think that not having to ship stuff from overseas is just better for the environment in general. And it's just really nice to support local brands and companies and businesses and things. So the final thing I wanted to report on is the state of my stash at the end of 2025. So over the course of the year, I knit 19,377 meters, which isn't too shabby, I don't think. I had to go double check that number because it seemed a bit ridiculous. And I will admit that it is skewing a little bit high, because there were a few whips that I started in 2024 and finished in 2025 that I found it a bit difficult to pull the numbers out of the total from. So we were skewed a little bit high, but not that much. And the other thing that I did do was that I halved the yardage for this blanket because I wasn't sure exactly how much I knit in 2024 and how much I knit in 2025, but I think it was sort of roughly half. So even though the number is a little bit hand wavy, I don't think it's too far off. And so 19 kilometers of yarn is a lot, and I'm pretty happy with that number. In total, I have 37,342 meters of yarn remaining, which is still a lot. But actually, I'm quite encouraged because if I keep knitting at the same rate and I don't buy way more yarn, it would only take me 2 or 3 more years to actually knit down my entire stash. And getting to stash 0 isn't really the goal. I mostly just want to make a decent dent in my yarn stash and feel better about how much yarn that I have and actually have it fit in the storage space that I've allocated for it. And so I'm actually quite encouraged by these two numbers put together, because even though 37 kilometers of yarn is a lot, if I'm getting through almost 20K of it every year, then it won't take me long to make a pretty decent dent in my yarn. On that note, one of the things that I'm pretty happy with is that I fully used up 20 yarns out of my stash. Admittedly, a lot of those were very small amounts of yarn, but to be honest, those are the things that I have the most trouble with using up anyway. So I'm pretty glad that I just have 20 whole amounts of yarn just gone out of my stash into projects. In total, since I started tracking, I've used up 31 yarns, and I have 139 left. So again, looking at those two numbers together, it's pretty encouraging. I am getting through things at a pretty decent clip. And so if I just keep going, I think I'm going to get my stash down to a manageable amount over the course of the next year or so, which I'm excited about. So those are all the numbers that I've got for you. I hope this was a bit of an interesting roundup. I know it's a bit of a different thing than normal, and I do actually have to give credit where credit's due. So I was very highly inspired for this video by Bailey from the Copycat Stitch, and she did a PowerPoint presentation for her year in review at the end of 2024. So I'll pop a link to where you can see that down below. If you do want to see my projects in more detail, then I actually made a spreadsheet of all of my projects and all of the statistics and things that I was interested in, and that's where I got all of the pretty pie charts from. So if you would like to take a look at that, then I'll put a link to it down below. There's more details, plus there are links to each of the Ravelry projects for all of my knitting projects in there. And if you'd like to see how I work through all of my projects and listen to me talk about them in more detail, then I made a roundup video of the first 9 months of my knitting in August or September. And then I've been podcasting and vlogging since then. So I'll put a playlist of my 2025 videos here as well, so you can watch those if you'd rather see more of a roundup knitting review style video as opposed to this sort of numbers presentation. But I will keep podcasting and vlogging throughout 2026. So if you'd like to follow along with my progress of my stash down and see my projects that I come up with for the year, then you can subscribe to the channel right here. And if you hit the bell icon down below, you'll get notifications from when I publish new videos. And if you'd like to see that playlist of the 2025 videos, then you can see that right here. And until next time, I'm Katrina Walser from Oliphant Cat. Happy knitting!